This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Getting today's show started is K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This week, the pair converse about fish and the importance of managing their population. Kelsey Andersen Onofre, K-State wheat pathologist, continues the show discussing wheat seed treatments and what scenarios make treatments more valuable. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show recommending producers take an inventory of what forage is on hand and what they'll need for the next 9 or 10 months. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. It's fall. We got cool nights, but even though it's starting to get cool, it's a good time to talk about ponds. So are we going to talk about fish?
We are. We're going to talk about some fish population management. You know, I love this time of year. You're getting hunting started up. A lot of people think after Labor Day you can't go fishing, and this is some of the best time of the year to go fishing, in my opinion. So excited to talk about fish a little bit today, Drew.
Why is it a good time to talk about fish, or to think about fish, or to even continue to fish after Labor Day?
Yeah, you know, we have a lot of different species in Kansas that, you know, they just change their habitats once that water temperature starts to cool down a little bit from those peak summer highs. And so, you know, fish like walleye that are at like cold water are starting to become a little bit more active. Some of the fish that have been up in the shallows that like a little bit warmer water starting to get a little bit deeper. So it's just kind of fun. You know, you get that change in the fish population structure, and thinking about where those fish might be and how they might be acting is kind of fun to think about, fun to talk about.
What do we need to think about? Where do we need to start if we're wanting to manage a fish population in a pond?
You know, one of the big things that happens, I get a lot of calls and people say, hey, I just bought this property with a farm. Where can I stock it? Right. And that's almost always how it leads in when someone gets a new pond. And one of the worst things you can do for a pond that you just bought is going out and stocking that pond. Right. Sure. And so a bigger problem, a much more common problem, is that you have too many fish in that pond. There haven't been enough taken out. You end up with too many mouths to feed. And so, you know, kind of understanding what's in your pond is a great place to start getting out there and doing some fishing, setting out some minnow traps, see what kind of smaller fish or invertebrates. There might be crayfish or other organisms with the importance of aquatic invertebrates. So, you know, kind of understanding what's going on in your pond is where you'd want to start, looking at the fish species that are there, and then kind of making a plan of, hey, what can I do with that, right? So understanding, you know, the species, the size structure, and then how far do you want to take it? That's going to kind of depend on your goals and how much you really enjoy, you know, getting out there and actually managing that fish population.
What would be a sign that we needed to do something?
Yeah. So, and again, you know, here you can take the easy route. So you can just look at the fish, right, and see, do they look healthy? And even if you're not an expert, you know, if you look at a few fish, you can kind of get a good idea, right? So are they a little bit fatter? Are their heads, do they just look too big for their bodies? But understanding the species that you have. So in your minnow trap, are you catching young fish that have, you know, been hatched this year and grown up? So they're young of the year fish. You know, they're reproducing that year. Do you have signs of reproduction? Do you have minnows that are maybe feeding some other fish? Looking at the population structure, how many predators do we have? How many prey do we have? What's the size of each of those? In the past, we've talked about relative weight. And if you want to take that next kind of step of understanding, are your fish, you know, what kind of shape are they really in? You want to start collecting some metrics, looking at the length of the fish and the weight of the fish and going back and calculating that relative weight. Good information that you could look at and figure out, hey, how are the fish really doing? But starting by looking is a great place to, you know, kind of gather some of that information.
Very cool. So what are some of the most common pitfalls or things that people do wrong that you notice when you're helping folks and they get one of those new ponds and they go out there and they start doing stuff?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things. One, like I said, just throwing fish in there and not knowing what you're doing. That's a waste of money, and it can actually, make the problem worse when you have good intentions. The other thing is being so overwhelmed or so nervous to do anything that you kind of freeze and don't do anything. So understanding that, but not having a harvest plan is a really big thing. And so we've been taught that catch and release is the way to handle everything. And in a pond, that's just not the case. You need to be taking some mouths out of that pond. The biomass can only, there's only a certain number of fish that can be in that pond and thrive.
Sure.
And so having a harvest plan, not always just catching and releasing. I think people have good intentions of, hey, I really like to catch crappie or like to, want to feed my bass, so I'm going to raise some shad and throw those in there. So people have good intentions again, but don't understand really what's going to happen to the population or the dynamics of that fish community if you start throwing different species in there. So adding species that maybe aren't desired. Habitat management, we come back to that all the time on this podcast because it's so important in terrestrial environments and aquatic. And so thinking about habitat management, and it's, habitat management is great when you do it, but it's not just kind of a, hey, I put a tree in there 5 years ago, or hey, I burned a property 7 years ago, and so I'm good because I burned it once, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's ongoing efforts. So kind of understanding what a goal is, having a clear goal, physically writing out that goal and the steps you want to take, and then looking at that. I mean, it's okay if you don't follow it step by step, but the act of writing it out and having something to reference really is huge.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One of the things I've heard people say when they get a pond and it's out of balance, they've got maybe too many sunfish or too many undesirable species from their point of view. Well, let's just go to the river and catch a 50-pound flathead and put in there.
Yeah. It's something you legally can do. I don't know that I would ever recommend adding fish from somewhere else into your pond. Generally getting those from a licensed producer is the way to go. The other thing you want to think about with your balance is understanding really the predator-prey balance in your pond. And so I think, are there a lot of bass but not a lot of bluegill, or are there a lot of bluegill but not a lot of bass? And understanding that dynamic will really help you give insight into if there's enough food there. A lot of times I'll go out to these ponds that haven't had anything happen in a really long time. They haven't been harvested. There hasn't been a lot of fishing activity, and you'll go catch cast after cast. You'll catch a 10-inch bass, right? And that's really indicative that there are too many mouths there. Those fish are stunted. The really important thing that I think a lot of people forget is that a 10-inch bass could be 6 years old, right? We tend to think that that's maybe a 2-year-old fish. But if there's so many mouths to feed that they're not getting the nutrition they need to grow, they could be really old. And if we start to think about population structure, even if we're able to take out a lot of those little bass, we're left with potentially a lot of really old, small, poor body condition bass or fish left in our pond, right? Same thing could happen with bluegill. I'm using the example of bass here, but in that example, it's really hard to get back to a fishery where you're going to feel like, hey, I'm catching 3, 4, 5 pound bass, and I really like this pond system that I have. So kind of understanding there's a cost benefit, right? So there's a financial side. There's also a time side. So you might be able to get that pond back. It might take 10 years. So do you have 10 years to invest in that pond, constantly working on it before you get back to where you want it to be? Or do you want to spend a little bit more money up front and then maybe 3 years have a fishery that fits kind of what you want to do? So a little bit of a tangent there, but I think that's a really important point to make.
So if we are out of balance, you said that trying to harvest our way back into balance doesn't always work and may not always be the best option. So what are some other ways of getting back into balance?
If you're at that point, it's very hard to get back, right? And so a lot of times what they're going to do is kill off the pond, right? Mm-hmm. Bring in a rotenone agent where the fish essentially can't breathe, and you kill every fish in that pond and you start over like it's a new pond. And that can also happen naturally.
Sure.
Right? So we can see fish kills that happen in ponds where, oxygen levels drop and you end up with a bunch of dead fish, coming on. And so that's something that fish kills, I don't want to say they're a good thing. Fish kills are not a good thing, but the silver lining in a fish kill a lot of times is that the population in many of the ponds wasn't where it needed to be. So it gives you kind of a fresh start to to start over. Two things really happen with a fish kill. There are fish kills that, the oxygen level slowly diminishes throughout the night, and then you get to the day and plants start to photosynthesize, and you start to see the oxygen levels go back up. And so depending on how low those oxygen levels go, you might have a few fish that die, and then they might be okay through the day. Or you can have a complete kill where the oxygen levels just get too low and everything dies.
Sure.
And so if you have a natural fish kill, not where someone has gone in and purposely killed them so we can start over fresh, but a natural fish kill, you generally want to wait for, a good season. If it happened in the summer, wait till the next spring and kind of reassess the fish population, see what's going on, and then make a plan from there.
So once we've got that pond healthy, you said that early on, you said harvest is important. So how do we go about making a plan for harvesting fish?
Yeah. And so, the first thing you need to do is think about, what do you want your pond to be? And so, it's amazing how often people haven't thought about that. They want to go catch big fish.
Yeah.
Well, does that mean big bluegill, big catfish, big bass? You want a little bit of everything, or what do you want, right? And so green sunfish, they're a great fish if you want to be able to take your kid out, your grandkid out, or yourself out, and every cast have a fun little fight, right? You're never going to have a 5-pound bass in that pond, but you're going to have fun times if that's what you like to do. So understanding what you like to do and what you want your pond to be is the first step, right? Because that's going to determine whether you harvest bass or bluegill or catfish, whatever you want to do.
Once again, that was K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts. You can listen to this full episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing seed treatments for wheat with K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Kelsey, first, can you tell us a little bit about the background and purpose for seed treatments?
Yeah, so wheat seed treatments are maybe they're one of the first things on our mind, but they might be one of the last things we're thinking about right now as we're preparing for planting here in Kansas. But they have a really important history, and they provide a lot of protection in a small package, right? So, back in, the early 1900s, some of our big diseases like common bunt or stinking smut were causing 25%, 50% yield loss in the region. It made it almost impossible to produce wheat. Now, that problem has largely been eliminated, except for, pockets of the state where we do see stinking smut or other seed-borne diseases pop up every year. And that's because of fungicide seed treatments. So they really came on the market in the 1960s. And now we have some really nice products, some newer fungicides, and they are very effective in a small package. So it's an important thing to think about. And they also can control a lot of different issues.
You mentioned stinking smut. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Kelsey?
I know. I saw your face kind of, you're like, stinking smut. That's a funny name for a disease. So, yeah, stinking smut, or sometimes we call it common bunt. It's a disease that survives on the seed coat. These spores survive on the seed coat after we harvest. If we don't apply a seed treatment, when we plant our seed in the fall into cool soils, those spores germinate, infect the plant, and the next season we have grain that's actually, instead of being filled with starch, it's filled with spores. And when those spores break open, they have this stinking smell, right? It's almost a rotten fish smell. And this can be a problem because it can degrade our quality of our seed, but also can result in yield losses.
And what other scenarios is using maybe a seed treatment really important?
Yeah, so seed treatments, especially when they have a fungicide in the mix, are, again, they control common bunt. They can also control loose smut. So that's another disease that instead of, causing spores to form in our grain actually cause a big black mass of spores to emerge instead of the wheat head, right? So another kind of funny name there, loose smut, but that's when we see right at heading. We see that head replaced with a black mass of spores, and then our seed becomes infected and we have a worse outbreak in the following year, right? So that right there, when we use that fungicide seed treatment, we control 2 important diseases. Also, we can provide protection against seedling blights. So there are some diseases that are soil-borne or that can survive on the seed coat that can reduce our stand establishment. So if we plant into nice, cool, wet soil, some of those fungi that are there in the soil or on our seed coat can cause some damping off and can cause reduced stand establishment. So that fungicide seed treatment can prevent those diseases and really help our plants have a fair shot, right? Get some good emergence there in the fall. Probably the last one we think about are some of our root and foot rots that can infect later in the season. I think we saw a good amount of a disease called Fusarium foot rot this year. That's one that can later in the season cause patches of white tillers in the field. If you look at the lower stem of your plant, you might see brown discoloration or pink discoloration. So seed treatments, they can provide some suppression for Fusarium root rot, especially early in the season, and also suppression for some of our other root and foot rots. They don't totally prevent those, but again, they can provide some suppression if we have those fungicides in the seed treatment mix.
And if the wheat field is for seed production, is it worth just taking that precautionary step?
Right. So with a seed production field, we have less tolerance for some of these diseases, right? Especially some of our bunts and smuts. So those would be great priorities for using a fungicide seed treatment. We can limit our exposure to those diseases, and they're a fairly inexpensive insurance policy. That's how we think about seed treatments, right? Maybe we won't get a extreme yield benefit in every season, but they prevent some of these major losses.
And what about after soybean harvest? Is there added concern during that time?
Yeah, so I think the other 2 pieces would be, if we have a seed insecticide in the mix, we can get some early season protection against aphids. So that's if we're going early, right? So if we're potentially getting in soon, we might be planting early. We might be worried about barley yellow dwarf virus. Those insecticides can provide some protection against barley yellow dwarf. If we're going late after soybeans, we're probably going into that cool, wet soil. Some of our root rots and our seedling diseases would be a bigger concern, right? So anywhere on either the front end of the optimum window or the back end of the optimum window, we might want to seriously consider those seed treatments.
So what is that balance between benefit and cost do you see as a wheat pathologist for seed treatments?
Yeah, so there's been some interesting data. Of course, if we're preventing a disease outbreak, we can see bigger yield benefits. But I think in some of the data that was recently put together by K-State, we see about a break even in any given year, right, for that seed treatment cost. So it really is, just an insurance policy. And typically we will get, at minimum a 1 to 2 bushel per acre increase, which will typically pay for the treatment.
What are some tips for making sure that treatment is a good seed treatment? Yeah,
so that's good. Sometimes we see cases of seed treatment failure, and in those cases, typically we see the slurry has been clumpy, or we didn't get complete coverage on the seed. So it's really important that our seed has that complete pink coloration and coating, that we didn't get, clumping in our mix. And sometimes we see, very poor applications where maybe 50% of the seed isn't treated. Well, in that case, right, 50% of your seed is exposed to the disease. So we want to make sure we have our slurry properly mixed and we're applying these seed treatments well.
And a reminder, we've focused towards fungicide seed treatments, but those aren't the only seed treatments out and about.
Right. So usually when we're thinking about our seed treatments, they can have a variety of components in the mix, right? Sometimes they have more than one fungicide. So we might have something like one of our triazole fungicides that can help with some of the fungi I talked about. bunts and smuts and root rots. You might have something like metalaxyl or mefenoxam. That's going to be for pythiums or other oomycetes that, they're kind of like fungi, but they're not quite fungi. We might have something like sidaxane. That's a Rhizoctonia specific product, right? So sometimes we get kind of a package of fungicides, and they work against different fungi. And then typically we'll also have an insecticide in the mix. So something like a Cruiser Max Vibrant cereals, for example, or just Cruiser will have an insecticide. And those can help with things like wireworms or, again, for things like aphids, which can transmit those viruses, like barley yellow dwarf virus, right? So, again, you usually get a full package of seed treatments, and usually that insecticide plus the fungicide can help. Occasionally, we'll also see things in the mix like a growth regulator or a growth promoter, right? So there are more options coming onto the market with additional products like that.
And seed treatments not lasting the whole growing season for wheat.
Right. So that's a key point, Shelby. Usually we get about 30 to 45 days of protection after emergence. After that, our product's worn off and our wheat's out there to fend for itself.
If people are wanting to find out more information on seed treatments for wheat, what's your recommendation?
So we do have a publication here at K-State. It's our Weed Seed Treatment Guide. We go through and provide the common diseases that these common seed treatments are labeled for, so you can find that at the KSRE bookstore.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some considerations when it comes to wheat seed treatments.
Great, thanks for having me.
That was K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link the publication that she mentioned, along with a recent Agronomy e-update article she wrote on this topic. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain, USDA research economist Matthew Rabbit, and former Farm Service Agency Administrator Val Docini as they discuss household food supply and sustainability as food security.
Blank as food security. The wide degree of answers to start that phrase includes having enough food for everyone everywhere to eat as food security. That's according to USDA economic researcher Matthew Rabbit, among the authors of the annual Household Food Security in the U.S. report.
There's a lot of very interesting findings that are coming out of this year's report. Food insecurity among U.S. households increased to 13.5% in 2023.
Ag producers have used sustainable practices in production long before that word became both popular and marketable. Former USDA Farm Service Agency Administrator Val Docini, now with Syngenta, sees sustainable ag practices as food security.
Sustainability really is essential to substantial food security and the ability to provide the tools to American farmers to ensure the kinds of yields that they'll need to feed not only the folks here in the United States, but the world.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk for this week's Milk Lines. We're now cutting to that short break.
Listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. Much of the forage season is over, and Kansas dairy producers should be taking an inventory now of the forage they have on hand and determining their forage needs heading into the winter season. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that this year's hay supply actually looks pretty good, but he recommends that producers secure the hay they'll need as soon as possible.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the forage needs for their dairy as we approach the winter season. You know, we're about to the end of the forage harvesting season for 2024. You may have a few things out in the field that you'll be harvesting yet before frost, but much of our forage season is over. So now it's time for you as a dairyman to spend some time balancing the forage books. In other words, looking at what you have available for supply, and then what are your needs going to be. In the dairy business, we always look at the supply of hay because a lot of times we have to purchase hay from the outside as we do not raise enough of that ourselves. So as we look at the supplies of alfalfa and grass hay as well as straw, we actually see fairly decent supplies out there this year in most areas of Kansas. There are some issues maybe in the southwest part of the state, but in general we're in better shape than we were a year ago. So I encourage you to sit down with your nutritionist and start having a discussion about really what do you need for the next year in terms of your silages, and then for your hay needs the next 9 to 10 months. As we look at the current markets out there, alfalfa hay that's dairy quality is still about $250 a ton. Straw is running about $100 a ton, and many of our grass hays are somewhere in that $120 to $140 a ton. So how does that figure into your total diet? As we look at what we have on hand, and particularly looking at your corn silages, determine with your nutritionist how much corn silage do I have available, and then how much would I like to feed in my lactating diets and other diets that I have to meet the needs of around the farm. As you have that discussion, you need to start thinking about what type of hay and what quality of hay you need to have as well. You might be looking at some byproducts, either wet or dry, to include in those diets as well to stretch some of those forage sources. Another possibility that you need to visit with your nutritionist about is winter forages. We still have time to plant triticale, wheat, rye, and that may provide some additional forage for us in the spring. That could be either harvested as a silage or a hay crop. Most commonly, we would harvest that as a silage crop so we get it off the field a little bit earlier, and we can get started on the next crop that we're going to grow next summer. Keep in mind that you need to consider relative cost as well as quality of these alternative forages. And that is why a conversation with your nutritionist is very, very important. While we may blend some of these into lactating diets, that'll be dependent on the forage quality that we actually harvest next year. So, careful conversation now, and the expectations for harvest next spring very, very important as you decide how you're going to utilize the forages that you have on hand, as well as what you need to purchase for the upcoming year. If you find yourself in a situation where you need to purchase forage from the outside to get through the next 9 to 10 months, particularly of hays, make sure that you speak for those supplies early on in the process. Waiting until we get past the first of the year may not be the best choice in terms of price as well as availability. This is particularly true sometimes of quality, so keep that in mind as you look at what you need to purchase in the next 9 to 10 months. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to carefully determine what their forage needs are and what they might need to purchase in the coming months.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.